So with that, I'll introduce Jessica Sturgess, Rejoinders and Rejoinders, Communication as Embodied Testimony.
All right, thank you. This paper begins with an insight borrowed from Deleuze and Guattari. In their collaborative work, What is Philosophy?, they define philosophy in distinction from science or the arts as a discipline which creates concepts. Concepts are not ready-made objects waiting around for someone to put them to use, but creations made in response to a particular problem. The problem I wish to explore today I draw from Merleau-Ponty, namely the insufficiency of theories of communication offered by either the traditions of empiricism or intellectualism as he outlines them in his Phenomenology of Perception. As we recall from Merleau-Ponty's typology, for the empiricist, communication is a process of transmission and reception, the exchange of information. The person desiring to communicate, although somehow the force of desire remains unaccounted for, culls together discrete bits of meaning that are somehow converted into audible sound, the mechanism of the voice, that is then spoken to a listener who, with the receiving mechanism of the ear, receives bits of sound and processes them into an intelligible meaning. The culling together of words for speech is the mere trace of consciousness stimulated by an external source. Quote, the given stimuli call the word up in accordance with the laws of neurological mechanics or those of association. End quote. Moreover, the word is but a psychic, physiological, or even physical phenomenon set alongside others and thrown up by the working of an objective causality. Were misunderstandings to occur, it is due to a breakdown in the speaking and listening mechanisms, or perhaps a physiological glitch that called up the wrong word. The intellectualist, on the other hand, understands the word as only, quote, the external sign of an internal recognition that makes no contribution to the recognition itself. Speaking becomes nothing more than an articulation, or, as Merleau-Ponty puts it, an external accompaniment to thought. Consequently, intellectualism encounters a problem in how the speaker, a private consciousness, is able to come together, that is, commune with other people. In other words, there's the pressing dilemma of solipsism. To attend to this problem of communication and the tensions between empiricism and intellectualism for Merleau-Ponty, I suggest an alternate concept, that of testimony. Concepts sometimes draw their names from new words. However, in this case, I turn to a long-held word both in religious and legal discourse reoriented toward different purposes. I'll use testimony to mark the experience of trying to speak in the midst of the impossibility of doing so. I'll say more on this later. Concepts, too, are not solitary travelers and are often found in dialogue with other proximal concepts. In this respect, to address the concept of testimony from a phenomenological perspective, I must first attend to two neighboring concepts, that of the body and the horizon. These two phenomenological explorations will, I am hopeful, offer a keen space for examining the problem of communication. A phenomenological style of thinking holds open a hope for describing our experiences of the world as they are actually experienced, and not as they are conceived by the discourses of science. Indeed, I intend to suggest here that the explanations of communication given down by scientific thought broadly, what we might call objective thought, fail to accord with our actually lived experience, and thus leave the core of who we are most profoundly misunderstood. Phenomenological thinking, in its practice of the epoche, or the bracketing of the natural world, that is the objective rendering of experience, allows for insight into the primordial workings of human being in the world. Insight into the role the body plays in being in the world, I argue, assists us in understanding the practice of communication as well. Furthermore, in an effort to show the body is always already hermeneutically textured, I shall turn at the very end of my talk to the thinking of Gadamer to enrich Merleau-Ponty's articulation of horizon, a term at the center of who we are and how we understand ourselves. Let us first turn then to the first complementary concept, body. As we know, the body for Merleau-Ponty is not merely an assemblage of tissue and organs and nerves, the anatomical configuration known as the human form. That body is nothing more than a corpse. Nor is the body the extension of matter with which the thinking mind must unfortunately deal. That body is nothing more than a cage. Rather, the body is that living manifestation of being in the world, our commitment to the world as the site through which we engage in meaningful projects. Merleau-Ponty states, quote, the body is the vehicle of being in the world, and having a body is, for a living creature, to be involved in a definite environment, to identify oneself with certain projects, and be continually committed to them. End quote. Echoing Heidegger, we see that it is the body, and not consciousness, that is engaged in the world. Our bodies and the world are imbued with intentionality and overflowing with meaning. This becomes clearer when we turn to the phenomenon of perception. When I perceive an object, Merleau-Ponty writes, quote, one phenomenon releases another not by means of some objective, efficient cause, but by the meaning which holds it out. There is a reason for the thing which guides the flow of phenomena without being explicitly laid down in any one of them. End quote. Said differently, in perceiving, there is a motivating phenomenon and a motivated phenomenon. For example, in viewing my friend down the street, the interposed objects between she and I, for example, trees, signposts, and parked vehicles, serve as a motivating phenomenon that shape my understanding and offer a pattern for the motivated phenomenon of my perceiving her as small, that is, as far away. At the level of perception of my body understanding itself within a world, there's an unarticulated understanding of the phenomena I witness without the aid of formal reason. Perceptual phenomena are given to us as integral wholes, suffused with meaning, not as a series of sense units nor a collection of innate ideas to be pieced together. Our bodies become what Merleau-Ponty terms the pivot of the world. We are the hinge or the space at which the world opens up as meaningful. The world, in constant communication then with our bodies, shows itself as a collection of possibilities, where or not our bodies can take up a particular task. Our bodies and the world are laden with possibility. Possibilities are always possibilities of something against the backdrop of other potential actions. To clarify the showing forth of world and perception, Merleau-Ponty draws from Gestalt psychology in order to sketch an understanding of the world and perception that resonates with our actually lived experience. For Gestalt psychology, perception in its most basic state involves a figure against a background. Either without the other makes perception impossible. Quote, the perceptual something is always in the middle of something else. It always forms part of the field. It is from within this field that something can be brought into relief and made meaningful. This brings us to our second complementary concept, the horizon. Experience for Merleau-Ponty and phenomenology in general takes place within a horizon of meaning. Like the horizon in a painting that frames the action in the foreground, the horizon of meaning gives boundary to our experience and understanding. There is no body without horizon. Although he reminds us that experience and perception are always against the background of a horizon, there's little sustained conversation in Merleau-Ponty of what a horizon means for experience and the new possibilities such an understanding might disclose. He states early in Phenomenology of Perception that looking at an object is, quote, to plunge oneself into it, and that, quote, the horizon is what guarantees the identity of the object through the exploration. In perception, we inhabit that which we perceive. Our bodies and the objects melt together in a mutual project. The horizon guarantees the identity of the object because it is always an object that shows itself against a particular background, a particular understanding of the world that brings the object into perception. When the object ceases to be at the forefront of attention and no longer stands in relief, it falls back into the larger world horizon, not in an act of disappearance, but of merging with the greater horizon of possibilities. For example, when I drank a cup of tea at my desk, I perceived the coffee, I drank tea, but I perceived coffee. When I drank a cup of coffee at my desk, I perceived the cup of coffee before me as the backdrop of a crowded and paper-strewn table, and it is from this background that I can perceive my cup of coffee and the meaning that it holds for me. However, this horizon can be continually expanded like a series of nesting dolls. Merleau-Ponty furthers this thought, making explicit his understanding of experience as a subject-object dialogue. Quote, the body is no longer conceived as an object of the world, but as our means of communication with it. To the world no longer conceived as a collection of determinate objects, but as the horizon latent in all our experience, and itself ever-present and anterior to every determining thought. End quote. The world shows forth as a horizon of possibility, the myriad potentials our bodies can take up and live out in meaningful ways. The particular things within the world horizon present themselves as invitations for undertaking particular projects. They solicit us and they have their say. Against the background of the broader horizon, the things of the world come forth as incomplete patterns of meaning to be completed through an interaction with the body. By conceptualizing the body as a means of communication, that is, as the site at which meaning is made, Merleau-Ponty makes space for understanding the body and its horizons as hermeneutically textured. Our bodies and the things of the world are already caught up in understanding, and our bodies tend towards things understandingly. The very constitution and meaning of our bodies is such that we are our horizons. Our bodies are hermeneutically textured with the inscriptions of our various horizons and sedimented meanings that we carry with us wherever we go. Against this background of two complementary concepts, the body and the horizon, what I wish to offer in closing are a few preliminary thoughts for understanding communicative practices as instantiations of testimony, a term I'm hopeful highlights the role of horizons in our communicative situatedness. A horizon of any given situation is ever-changing and moving with the current of lived experience. Because of the dynamism of horizons, a horizon is ever and always an incomplete unity, tenuously held forth as complete for only but a moment, only to fall back again into the flux of experience and finitude. Merleau-Ponty makes clear, quote, "The synthesis of horizons is no more than a presumptive synthesis. For a moment, the horizons of those in conversation fuse, and understanding is achieved. However, such understanding is temporary and recedes into the larger horizon with the additional unfolding of possibilities. Horizons, by their very nature, always withdraw despite our persistent attempts to reach them. Consequently, every communicative act is provisional, and no final word is to be had. With the primacy of horizons for experience and for understanding, the impossibility of communication is brought into relief just as clearly as its possibility. Indeed, communication occurs all the time and all around us, and yet it is impossible if we understand it within the confines of intellectualism and empiricism. If we assume communication to be the mere transference of information held by one consciousness and somehow conveyed to another, which it isn't, then communication is from the start always already unable to occur. Under these circumstances, as Merleau-Ponty so eloquently puts it, the existence of other people is an outrage for objective thought. For phenomenological thought, however, other people are not an outrage, but a gift, an opportunity for the achievement of the fusions of horizons in a given situation. However, communication is impossible in a more life-affirming manner as well. When we dwell together in the world and we communicate with one another, we speak what I like to think are impossible words. With the withdrawing of every horizon into the greater world horizon, all attempts at closure are precluded. As a presumptive synthesis and not a given completion, our communicative practices are always open to refiguring and renegotiation. Consequently, our communicative practices are imbued from the start with a strange humility. The humility that whatever might be said is never all that can be said, even and perhaps especially when we've said too much. The communicative event is unable to be enclosed within a particular context and always has, as a part of its structure, a remainder. The remainder is what was not said, perhaps what could not be said, within the particular attempt at sharing an experience. Moreover, the experience, as it is necessarily mediated in order to become intelligible, always loses something in the process, only the recuperation of which would make communication as the transference of information possible. There is within all communication something left undone, untouched, uncommunicable, preventing the complete and direct sharing of an experience. Like Penelope's weavings, for those of you who like Homer, communication undoes itself for the sake that it might be undertaken once more. The remainder of the unsaid is something to which we can only appeal and never confirm. It has force and consequence only in its withdrawal and absence. Communicative practices are able to break with and enter into new contexts. What is said and the experience of presence can never collapse into sameness. With the creation of new contexts, that is, the creation of new responses, relations, and practices, what is being said infinitely differs from experience. We are left then with the task of rethinking how we think about communication and in search of a new vocabulary. Religious discourse, whatever problems it may hold, and I do believe it holds problems, is one of the few remaining spaces for thinking outside of the logic of calculation and exchange. The language of religion has a tradition of speaking about the impossible and the wonderful, of a present shared in common but unable to be articulated in full. In the face of that which cannot be articulated, we testify. That is, we speak humbly words that can never clothe the unspeakable in full. We testify in the presence of transcendence, whether vertical or horizontal. It is my position here that every communicative practice, from the most mundane, for example, could you please hold the door, to the most extraordinary, I love you, carries with it, because spoken within a larger world horizon, a dimension of transcendence. The grander horizon transcends its participants and is the condition for the possibility of their coming together in conversation. Communication as testimony liberates us from the calculated worlds of the empiricist and the intellectualist and opens us to the communicative possibility of being otherwise. In highlighting the provisionality of every communicative act, it keeps the communicative disclosure of further possibilities open rather than foreclosed by assumptions of the complete transference of information. When we testify, we are aware that something else can always be said. In this sense, testimony forefronts freedom, the freedom of an ever-expanding horizon of possibilities that can be taken up and spoken in particular circumstances. Moreover, this freedom is always understood and embodied as caught up in the mutual interplay of the body, others, and the world. Every other stands forth as a gift and not merely the threat of pain, a gift of the possibility of shared world disclosure, a gift for the overflowing of meaning and movement of both horizons and bodies. Thank you.
A few minutes for questions directed to, and Jessica, you can field your own.
All right, great, awesome.
What do you think there can be an experience within speech itself, or some kind of experience of speech? But where it's coming from is, do you think that the distinction between speech and experience is a strict one? Because that seems to be what troubles so much phenomenology, and that's where Fink ends his famous essay on Husserl, with these paradoxes which arise when the phenomenologist tries to speak for the other. And the reason for that is that the meaning is always transparent to the phenomenologist, and it's not to the other. In Fink's essay, it kind of shows that distinction, it's almost collapsing. It's there, but the distinction between the I and the other, it's just, it causes these paradoxes, but it's like, he's clearly pointing beyond it, and I think that's where Derrida and Levinas go with phenomenology. But I was wondering how you see that in Merleau-Ponty, whether there is that kind of strict distinction still between speech and experience, which seems to collapse later on in the 20th century, or how do you kind of see that?
Okay, so I'm not familiar with Fink's essay, so I can't approach the question from that direction. Though, maybe in the future I can. I have some reading to do. But I do think, at least when Merleau-Ponty is talking in terms of the empiricist and the intellectualist, right, his two primary opponents, that there is a strict distinction. But I'm not sure what I think about it for Merleau-Ponty, but I do think that that you can experience speech, but as soon as you try to talk about it, you run into the same problem of not being able to encapsulate it in full. But I don't think it's a problem in the negative sense. I think that's something that we perhaps ought to cherish, right? That's the great thing about language, is that we can't ever say everything, right? That would be total closure and awful and violent in many respects. So I don't think I want those two to conflate into one another. I'm not sure if that addresses your question, but I'm not also sure how to address it without utilizing the reading that you're taught.
No, I think that does clarify. I mean,
okay.
It would seem to. I mean, it seems like a basic presupposition of all phenomenology. You have to have that distinction.
In the back.
Briefly mentioned a certain special type of speech, and that is religious speech.
Mm-hmm.
But you didn't
So the word I want to use, and it's by no means my own word, so obviously French phenomenological thinking has taken it up, is testimony. Right? And testimony has two different histories: a legal history, right? You have to testify in court, and a religious history. We testify to our experiences of transcendence, whether it's the transcendence that one experiences vertically with something like a god, or the transcendence that is experienced horizontally or asymmetrically with the face of the other. And I think religion, right, I'm all for taking things without taking the whole, right? So I think we can take the language of testimony from certain religious traditions and use it in our own way without carrying with it all the baggage. I know you're not supposed to do that, but I think you can borrow terms and concepts and make something new with them. But the way I would think of religious and religious language is strangely more from the American tradition. So religion in a kind of Emersonian sense. And so I don't have deeply Christian commitment. So when I think about testimony, I think more of Ruffald or Emerson's description in his essay Circles, right? So everything that we try to say is infinitely broadened because you get to one depth and you find that it's deeper still. Or my favorite example comes from Thoreau, when he says, he's talking about a cow in all situations, but he's talking about how you can't find words that are extravagant enough, so extravagant, that walk around far enough his own experience. And I think those are religious vocabularies. I don't think you have to take with it the whole religious tradition, but I think you can borrow the insight of being overwhelmed with one's own experience and trying to put it into words and being fully unable to do so. Does that help?
One more question, please.
So you're describing testimony as sort of open-ended and incomplete, and just really simply, so does this sort of phenomenological description of testimony or communication, does this imply a notion of community, or given that phenomenological description, what sort of notion of community does that lend us to think? Or maybe what's the relationship between this description of testimony and the possibility of community?
I think the community that it would have to call forward would be a contingent one and one that's always provisional. So its members are always open to refiguration. So I don't think it calls for a kind of community or community that can never be closed, but that has to remain continually open to new refigurations and new possibilities. The way I understand testimony is that it's infinitely open, right? As soon as you think it's closed down, it opens up again, and like series of concentric circles.
Thank you. Thanks.